On behalf of the Observatory on Latin America, OLA, of the New School, I am pleased to welcome you all to this evening for the first public lecture of the third edition of the President Néstor Kirchner Fellowship 2013-2014. The OLA, as many of you know, was formally launched at the New School in September 2006 by the current Argentine President, Cristina Fernández de Kirchner, and it is directed by Michael Cohen. We are working at the OLA during a time of interesting political change and renewed interest in Latin America. Progressive leaders in the region are seeking new policies and approaches to strengthen democracy, to define new economic and social policies, and to achieve social justice in their countries. I am pleased to present again in this occasion, as in the other public lectures of our prior 6 fellows in the last 2 years, the 3 main objectives of the OLA: to study, to link, and to mobilize. First is to study and observe the process of political and economic change in Latin America. Second is to link institutions in the US and Latin America by strengthening understanding of the challenges of building a social democracy in our globalized world. For this purpose, we have created opportunities for Latin American leaders and to direct express their views to audiences in New York, and overall the OLA hosted 70 public events in the New School. The third objective is to mobilize resources and ideas together with Latin American institutions to further these goals. The work program of the OLA is organized around 5 themes: the President Néstor Kirchner Fellowship, about which our President David Van Zandt will talk; the Latin America on the Move program, which brings speakers to New York, and among them we have Tabaré Vázquez, President of Uruguay; Ollanta Humana as a candidate when he was proposing for Peru; Néstor Kirchner several times, and the last in 2010, and Rafael Correa, President of Ecuador. We have him in 2011. Another program is Building Latin American Bicentennials, which has held 2 international calls for papers and audiovisuals, and which has put the OLA on the map of the region. We published in 2012 a book with the results of the first call for papers, and now we are preparing the second book as the result of the second call that we are hoping to publish in 2014. Design and Social Development is a 3-year-old collaborative program that we are doing from the New School with the Chulalongkorn University of Bangkok at the University of Buenos Aires, and we are launching a new initiative, the Cuba program, about we will talk in other venues. All of this can be seen in our website, and now I am honored to introduce the President of the New School, David Van Zandt.
Thank you very much, Margarita. I want to extend a welcome to all of you here tonight, and a special welcome to Ambassador María Perceval, who is the Argentine permanent representative to the UN. It's great to have you with us. In a few moments, we will ask her to introduce our Kirchner Fellow. I'd also like to extend a special welcome to Ambassador Jose Luis Perez Gabilondo. It's great to have you back here. Actually, if you were here last year too, both of you back here at the New School, in a different room this time. But it's great to have you here. You've both been very strong supporters of OLA, and we appreciate that greatly. The President Néstor Kirchner Fellowship Program was established in 2011 to honor the legacy of the former president. The idea behind it is to bring to the New School young South American leaders in both the academic and public service spheres. This reflects our core commitments here at the New School to creative and critical thinking about global social issues, as well as being socially engaged. So in looking at candidates, we looked both at their academic record, but also at what they had done in terms of working in the public sector, contributing through non-NGOs or other entities. The fellowship has been made possible by generous support from one of our trustees here at the New School, Julian Studley, as well as our partner, the Universidad Nacional de San Martin from Buenos Aires. This year, we had over 100 applicants from 10 countries. The selection process was rigorous. Let me assure you that, gentlemen. It was very rigorous. And we had 3 different stages to it. The initial jury met at the University of San Martin in June. There was a second round in which an international jury from 10 different countries, including some faculty from the New School, reviewed the candidates, and Ambassador Perceval was part of that evaluation. And then the final jury met in Buenos Aires in August to select the three winners. I was very fortunate and honored to participate in the final round again, along with Carlos Ruta, the rector from Universidad Nacional de San Martin, and Cecilia Najon, the Argentine ambassador to the United States, Jorge Aguelo, the Argentine ambassador to the United States, Jorge Taña, the former foreign minister of Argentina, Francisco Carrion, former foreign minister of Ecuador, Juan Carlos Tedesco, the former minister of education of Argentina, Cecilia Tedesco Boca, the chief of cabinet of the governor of the Central Bank of Argentina, representing Governor Mercedes Marco del Pont, and finally Maria Nieves Rico, representing the United Nations Economic Commission on Latin America. I'd also like to recognize tonight Eliana Versas, who's coordinating who has coordinated our OLA teams in Buenos Aires that actually manage and do a lot of the hard work behind the fellowship. Thank you. And also we have here today to work with our new coordinator of OLA, Desiree Lavecchia. Welcome to you as well. This year's winners are tonight's speaker, Germán Linzer from Argentina, also Maria Villa from Colombia, and Fernando Kleiman from Brazil. Both of our latter 2 winners will speak here at the New School and visit us at the New School here in March. And as we look to next year, we always have to look ahead. UNSAM, the University of San Martin, has appointed 2 new directors for the fellowship. Professors Christian Asinelli and Marcello Buffacchi, if I got that right. And our call for the 2014-2015 fellowships will open in December of this year. This year, unlike past years, we will focus on three themes rather than the 10 we had put out before. This theme for the next round, the 4th round, will be media, public policy, and cities for inclusive development. Well, now I'd like to introduce Ambassador Perceval. As I mentioned, she is the Argentine permanent representative to the UN. She has an extensive academic and political experience, being a professor of philosophy. She's also a former senator and chair of the Defense Committee in the Argentine Senate. She's Argentina's former undersecretary for human rights, and she currently represents Argentina on the UN Security Council. And even more importantly, she served as president of the UN Security Council in August of 2013, during what many of you remember as very difficult debates over the international response to chemical weapons in Syria. Ambassador, it's great to welcome you back.
Thank you. Okay. Well, really thank you for inviting me to this ceremony. It's really an honor for me as Ambassador of Argentina in the United Nations to share with you this moment. And I first want to thank the New School in general, but in particular, Margarita, you're a closely friend of this utopia that born many years ago and today is a great reality. And thank you, President Mr. David Van Zandt, President of the New School. And I want to thank the Observatorio Latinoamericano in particular for inviting me to be part of this wonderful initiative. The Néstor Kirchner Fellowship embodies so much of what we believe about politics and about we have practiced over the years. In this case, the perfect combination of academic excellence with political commitment. This view has come to redefine the very meaning of political activism. It is very happy news that words like militante, so common many decades ago, are being used again in order to describe this combination of passion for public service and social change, now with an equally strong emphasis on professional training, collective experience, academic and social knowledge, and the skills needed to turn the government into a leading force of social equality and economic development. And in my double capacity as militante, and ambassador, then I also need to add these values that the Néstor Kirchner Fellowship promotes also guide us in our understanding international affairs and its multiple dimensions beyond diplomatic relations. This was an area of government for a long time co-opted by a few families and supposed experts almost unaccountable to the people that they actually had to serve. Among the many significant transformations occurred during the last years, one particularly relevant for us today is the renewed consciousness of how foreign affairs can be placed at the service of human rights, human and economic development, political independence, and international solidarity and cooperation. And it is an excellent idea that the combined goals of academic excellence and commitment with public service are invoked under the name of Néstor Kirchner. First, because that was what guided Kirchner's relation with youth and with politics, an almost obsessive ambition to find new people with new ideas, with new energies, people who were eager to dedicate their life to public service. Second, because this combination of scientific knowledge and political commitment has guided, under his and Cristina Kirchner inspiration, the massive incorporation of youth into politics and policy making in Argentina, one of the most remarkable dynamics of the last decade, and I'm sure one of the most durable legacies. Third, because a growing number of young leaders arrive from the Argentine co-organizer of this fellowship, the Universidad Nacional de San Martín, UNSAM. And for those who are not familiar with it, UNSAM, along with other 8 national universities created in the last 12 years, is also a young institution offering free, high-quality graduate education in working-class suburbs of Buenos Aires. 7 out of 10 students registered in these universities are first generation of students in the education system. And fourth, finally, but particularly important, because this combination between social commitment, academic skills, and hands-on knowledge has been also at the basis of the long friendship and understanding that the government of Argentina and the new school have built over the last years. It has been a fruitful encounter between a progressive university and an administration that has recovered the role of government and the importance of politics for building a more egalitarian, free, and democratic society. So I want to celebrate that too. The award of this year goes to Linzer, a person that in many respects represents this kind of new leadership that emerges in Argentina and in many Latin American and Caribbean countries. Committed with his ideas, well-trained in public administration, dedicated to both public service and intellectual production. Of course, Linzer will describe his work in detail. He makes a very interesting point in terms of developing a specific framework for the understanding of the relationship between science and technology and the needs of developing countries. The author explores the changes in the understanding of intellectual property in the United States and its impact abroad as a case study of the forceful application of the framework of the developed economies in countries with a totally different economy and social dynamic. Linzer describes the impact of the changes and the understanding of intellectual property in the United States during the 80s, and it would be great to hear from him the evolution of those changes up to the present days in the United States and elsewhere. And equally important, it would be interesting to hear about the impact of that evolution in the agricultural industry, an area that Linzer knows intellectually and practically, and that is crucial for Argentina and for its relation with the global economy. But his work also invites us to another reading of the recent past, one about the journey of ideas and policies across the hemisphere, one about the multiple influences between the United States and the developing countries, the crucial place of Latin America, and the transformations occurred in these relationships during the last decade. Very briefly, Linzer focuses in the United States in the 80s as a moment of critical transformations. We are all familiar with some general characteristic of the changes that symbolize the period, namely the liberalization of the economic forces under President Ronald Reagan, and the combined reduction of government intervention and attack to organized labor as two obstacles to the economic growth and competitivity. Economic growth and competitivity without people and without labor organizations. From this basic framework, at the end of that decade emerged a set of ideas presented as a prescription to heal the problems of the Latin American economies and that we all know now under the name of the Washington Consensus, or, I prefer, Reaganomics. But Linzer analyzed this political, ideological, and economic process in a much more specific and crucial field, the one about research and development. The large set of measures aimed at encouraging technological innovation are led by the Bayh-Dole Act of 1980. I read it because I am a former senator. No, thank you for teaching me. And that Bayh-Dole Act of 1980, chronologically and economically at the very foundation of the neoliberal decade. The act basically allowed different private entities to exploit for their own benefit the result of research financed with federal funds. It is considered the center of the technological dynamism and job creation of the United States and an answer to the diagnosis of the lack of incentives for private investment in research and development. More important, the Bayh-Dole Act has been the inspirational force for the reforms of the institutional systems of science and technology in Latin America in the following decade. From today's vantage point of view, this process is self-evident as the consequences that had in Latin America the idealization of the short-term private initiatives as the basis of fragmented societies and economics. I quoted Linzer's paper. This form of absorbing ideas and policies and initiatives characterized the relationship of Latin America with the United States for decades. But I want to complement that picture of the period with an open question about a movement in the opposite direction, one of Latin America not as absorbing policies already working in the United States, but as an almost imaginary land, although tragically real, in which policymakers could explore policies never applied in the United States in order to see how they worked, how to explain them academically, how to support them politically. Because if it is true that United States legislation about intellectual property, among many other initiatives, was later transferred to Latin America, isn't it also true that many ideologically radical forms of neoliberal economic reforms were tried first in Latin America before they were fully expanded in the United States? And even more important, isn't it true that the forms of political coercion and support that accompanied this transformation were first carried out in our region and then presented as legitimate in the United States? In the end, it was before the neoliberal reforms arrived at full speed in the American economy that Milton Friedman and a large group of future American officials praised the Chilean miracle operated under Pinochet. Even more clear, it was before becoming president and before the Bayh-Dole Act was passed that in 1978, the then governor of California, Ronald Reagan, analyzed the performance of the Argentine dictatorship during a radio program for the American audience, assessing that the dictatorship's Minister of Economy, and I quote, Martínez de Hoz, is the architect of what might turn out to be one of the most remarkable economic recoveries in modern history. Only to add, with the tragic coldness of fanatism, that miracle was done on the basis of a massive state terrorism, acknowledging, and I quote, the sad reality that there will be a certain number of people that the government will never be able to account for. In parallel, the changes to the Glass-Steagall Act in the middle 1980s is a perfect complement of these changes. The Glass-Steagall Act, as you know better than me, had been adopted right after 1929 economic crash in order to diminish the enormous power of the financial markets and to protect the savings of ordinary people. Both this deregulation of the financial market and the privatization of intellectual property are steps towards the 30-70 society. 30% of people included, 70% excluded, the ideal of society not only for Reagan, but also for Thatcher, the Latin American presidents of the 90s, and our own dictatorships. Latin America, then, as a main destiny of a unique United States export, the economic forces, institutional frameworks, and ideological explanation already tried domestically, but also America Latina as a field of experimentation of radical, fanatical ideas that only later were going to be applied upon the United States population. For the liberal reforms that swept the hemisphere from the 70s to the 90s, the US was a source of resources and inspirations, as Linzer clearly shows. He shows us in his book clearly this situation. But his book, not only your paper, is the future. But in the same period, for the US elites that pushed for these reforms at home, the examples were not in New York or Chicago or Texas. As Reagan's speech shows, their visions were realized in places like Buenos Aires, with the background of a massive bloodshed. Their true city upon a hill was Santiago. I think it is more than important to be aware of the mutually reinforcing tendencies that shaped the period of economic reforms of the previous decades. It is historically relevant, but it is also a key factor in order to understand these first years of the 21st century and the radical reconfiguration of our region under a new wave of governments and a new courageous take about what kind of societies we want, what kind of societies we need. I want to thank Linzer for his ideas that help us to understand the period, and I also want to thank the New School for giving me the opportunity to share these brief reflections with you. Works like this one from Linzer are the kind of contribution of the new generation in order to understand not only the past from which we are coming from, but more important, the challenges that we have ahead of us. Thank you very much.
Good evening, everyone. It's my great pleasure to share this public lecture with you. I would like especially thank all the members of the Observatory Latin America, the authorities of the New School University, and the representatives of the Argentinian state for this incredible opportunity. Well, let's get started. As you may know, last year has been very important for science, technology, and innovation policies in Argentina, as for the first time in our history, we have been in the presence of a policy transcending all actions and instruments ever executed in that field in science, technology, and innovation policies. In 2007, the Ministry of Science, Technology, and Productive Innovation was created. Among other measures, the increase in the public budget for the area, the reformulation of the strategic plan with high social participation, and the build of a professionalized ministerial structure were one of the main actions in that area. However, the situation does not look simple. There are many achievements, but also major challenges. In spite of the continuity and consolidation of science, technology, and innovation policies, the purpose of contributing to the achievement of a qualitative change in national production has not been accomplished. The national production pattern is still based on natural comparative advantages and on a relatively small group of industrial capacities. Similarly, science and technology indicators do not seem to have delivered the expected results. The question then is to develop knowledge in order to understand the limits to technological development in countries like Argentina and other main countries in Latin America. The hypothesis of my work is that the mainstream conceptual framework, which serves to the design of technological policies in Latin America and in Argentina, is not appropriate to understand the development processes of dependent countries. In that sense, I would like to propose a historiographic approach to the interpretation of the technological development processes to suggest some political solutions and to contribute with managerial lines of actions. Indeed, I will try to complete that table. What are the differences to initiate a sustainable development processes between developed countries and developing countries? What is the role of the state in the development processes? Which kind of theory is needed to understand and support the development processes? The structure of this talk will be, at the beginning, to show the emergence of a new technological paradigm, the description of main conceptual framework, and the proposal of the US as a role model. The recommendation of policies from the mainstream conceptual framework to developing countries. After that, a critical revision of the US case and the mainstream theory. And finally, conclusions and proposals. Okay, over the past decades, it seems to have been established a new technological paradigm based on 3 technologies: biotechnology, nanotechnology, and information and communication technologies, ICTs. These technologies are different, but have some characteristics in common. Firstly, they are technologies with a comprehensive and massive application. Almost everything we see, touch, taste, etc., can be modified by these technologies. Secondly, these technologies are less capital-intensive and more brain-intensive in relation with other main technologies from the previous paradigm: chemicals, pharmaceutical, steel, nuclear energy, aircraft, automotive industry, etc. This reduced need for capital is the reason why countries with good natural resource endowments and good scientific capabilities, like Argentina, try to base their technological development in these technologies. It seems to be possible for public institutions or small companies to obtain new products based on them. For example, Genentech in biotechnology, Microsoft or Apple in ICTs were created by a group of entrepreneurs that managed to capture the interest of venture capitalists and created multinational corporations. The academia began to realize that the brain-intensive business had not only their special technical requirement, but also a particular financial structure according to the stage of development of the product: angel capital, seed capital, venture capital, and finally IPO. In the same way, they have particular intellectual property requirements, particular institutional requirements, etc. The experience of biotechnology and ICT gave birth to a new area of studies, the studies on policies, management, and business for science, technology, and innovation processes. One main academic antecedent of studies of technological change in relation with economic development comes from Joseph Schumpeter, who highlighted the importance of R&D and innovation for economic growth. That is the reason why the most important part of the author in this field are called neo-Schumpeterian. the neo-Schumpeterian and their eclectic fusion with other theoretical approaches, evolutionist, authors of the path dependency theory, institutionalists, etc., make up the mainstream academic approach to the technological development studies. Even when these approaches that constitute the mainstream are very different among them, they share the emphasis in the institutional system for the economic and technological development, as you can see in this slide. By the way, in the experience of this fellowship, I met Professor Richard Nelson of Columbia University, who is a very respectable and creative scientific. The institutional system consists of formal rules, constitutions, laws, property rights, etc., and informal rules, taboos, customs, tradition, etc. In the case of innovation, the institutional system involves different things, like finance system, educational system, intellectual property system, etc. The framework of institutions shape this interaction. Among the most important elements of the system, firms, universities, and governmental agencies. In that sense, there could be good national systems of innovations and bad ones. The good ones are those in which the state would be able to generate adequate incentives for private investment in technology and efficient management of technological processes in public institutions, companies, and between them. That would be the difference among economies, a state capable of creating that system of incentives more consistent with awards to technology businesses. Empirical information is gathered showing how technologically developed countries have become so by creating an institutional framework tailored to develop technology business and entrepreneurship. While Freeman, in 1987, based his work on the Japanese experience to identify and characterize a successful national system of innovation, the modification of the American institutional system in the 80s is considered the policy reference. It will show how the improvement of system of incentives resulting from an appropriate institutional system could increase competitiveness through technological development. The institutional system was modified by the amendment of the intellectual property rights and the creation of what I called technology transfer laws, which also use the intellectual property to modify the mechanism of incentives. On the one hand, due to the risk and size of R&D investment, the updates of the US Patent and Copyright Acts would have allowed for greater protection and so more incentives to R&D private investments. On the other hand, a lot of measures, instruments, and laws were established with the objective of strengthening the bond between academia with business and the creation of small technology-based companies. That is a part of the list of that numerous measures that were developed in that sense. However, the Bayh-Dole University and Small Business Patent Procedure Act should be particularly mentioned. The Bayh-Dole Act is a legislation dealing with intellectual property and aimed to transform the relation between public institutions and private companies on the basis of the possibility of registering, licensing, and exploiting the result of research funded with federal funds. Consequently, it could give incentives to universities, non-profit institutions, and small businesses so that they could obtain earnings and royalties from these intellectual property rights. Certainly, the result of the Bayh-Dole Act are significant in terms of university patenting, technology transfer, and establishment of businesses and employment. as you can see in the slide. Then, if laws that encourage IP, technology transfer, and the creation of small businesses are the basis of development, why do not apply it in America Latina and Argentina? Indeed, most Latin American countries should promote a new system of incentives favorable to technological business, in the same way that it would have happened in the US. From this mainstream conception, the new system of incentives should change what is considered the culturally traditional way of operating of the components of the national system of innovation in America Latina, in Latin America. Namely, the industrial companies are rent-seeking. The governmental agencies are corrupt and inefficient. The research institutions are detached from reality. Based on the mainstream conceptions, the technological development, it could be said that the atavisms and characteristics of our cultural idiosyncrasy translated into institutional and business dysfunctions are largely responsible for the national technological lagging. Let me recreate the following conversation with a very important professor of this university. That professor emphasized the role of the institution for development. When I asked him why Latin America has still difficulties in maintaining a sustainable development process, the answer was, firstly, I don't know. But he said, you were a colony of Spain. It's a legacy and your history. That is the same interpretation of numerous authors. For example, Angus Madison, in his book Explaining the Economic Performance of Nations, seems to have found a correlation between the economic performance of nations and the colonial legacy. Also, in the classical book of Max Weber, you can find something similar. Let me mention that it also has a moral consequence, which I will not discuss, but you can imagine. If the difference between economies were just cultural, the valuable theory should be the one which allowed characterizing and analyzing the institutional organization design in countries of greater wealth and development. The developed countries, especially the US, became the worldwide model for the rest of the countries. Summarizing, for the mainstream conception of science, technology, and innovation, there are no real barriers for development, just cultural. There is no need for a strong state, just one which could create conditions for private investment in R&D and entrepreneurship. There is no need for a critical theory for developing processes. Just a descriptive analytical framework of successful cases in developed countries would be enough. Now, let me draw your attention to the experience of Latin America and the situation in Argentina. In the 90s, based on the recommendation of multilateral financial institutions and the policy recommendation of the mainstream conception on science, technology, and innovation, most Latin American countries tried to promote a new system of incentives favorable to technological businesses in the same way that it would have happened in the US. But when those policies finally failed, as in the case of Argentina, the mainstream conception, also shared by Argentinian experts, insists on our cultural aversion to change, risk, and entrepreneurship. Then, do we have to continue relying on the mainstream diagnosis and insisting on similar policies? To respond to that question, I would like to review the US case from a critical perspective. I would like to show the real role of the state in the case of the US. The objective is to show that the role of any state in a successful development process goes further than the generation of adequate incentives to private sector, and that the technological development in the new paradigms is not based on the small technological companies. As already mentioned, US laws on IP protection and technology transfer were amended or enacted in the early 80s. At that time, the American economy would also undergo a significant change, the transformation of a society so far based on the so-called welfare state to a neoliberal economics personified by Reagan and Thatcher in the United Kingdom. In the mid-60s, the speed of the American growth, which so far had benefited financially and commercially from the war and the reconstruction process, began to slow down. The US economy started to feel the impact of the industrial competition generated by companies from European countries, Japan, and the so-called new industrialized countries. In the early 80s, as the US government perceived that it was losing its leadership, it responded to world economic and technological changes by planning its readaptation to compete in the new technological paradigm with advantage. The United States were and are the country with the highest investment in basic research in the world, but was technologically lagging in relation to the performance of other countries which also use the results of such basic research for their own technological development. In ICTs and biotechnology, the United States had and sought to maintain international superiority, which was declining in other highly technological areas. Therefore, it needed to plan ahead in order to avoid the catch-up process, which had undergone in other fields. In the early 80s, the United States undertook changes in intellectual property that can be understood as a way of technological protectionism. This technological protectionism would materialize in two steps. The first one, it would be necessary to withdraw technologies that were in the public domain and turn them into protectable technologies, establishing in this way a barrier to the catch-up for developing countries. The second one, it would be necessary to make the scientific and social resources of the country available exclusively to the development of the American capital. The two main ways in which technologies were withdrawn for the public domain were, firstly, making basic research results previously widely spread through publications patentable. This was achieved by making the difference between invention and discovery vaguer, and the need to show the industrial application of research results less rigorous. For example, in June of this year, 2013, in the case of myriad genetics, the Supreme Court unanimously ruled that the DNA reply can be protected. The second measure was ensuring that just as the new technologies were protected within the US, other countries, potentially competitors, had to agree to do the same. The promotion of the global harmonization on IP came through the agreement on trade-related aspects on intellectual property rights, TRIPS. For developing countries, the TRIPS agreement was compulsively negotiated in conjunction with the trade conditions which developing countries face to export their commodities and light industry goods to developed markets. If considered in some detail, the ones which promoted the global intellectual property harmonization were the American, European, and Japanese pharmaceutical industries and the American-Japanese microchip production industries. Also, to make the scientific and social resources of the country available exclusively to the development of the American capital was also enacted the Bayh-Dole Act. This law aims at protecting universities' technologies that previously stayed in the public domain. The intention of transforming a scientific into a businessman would generate the incentives to do that. Something that is not always mentioned is that the Bayh-Dole Act also requires that the technological products obtained with federal funds will be manufactured substantially in the US. Indeed, the results of the law were not what it proclaimed, as the large companies were the most benefited from it. They were benefited through two mechanisms. First, owing to the lobby of large economic groups, in 1983, Bayh-Dole's scope was expanding to include large businesses to be treated in the manner prescribed under the Bayh-Dole Act. Second, another more essential mechanism through which large corporations were benefited is because a small company does not have a finished product. It just has a technology that is a work in progress. For launching a biotechnological product onto the market, a multimillionaire investment is necessary in order to continue doing research, to protect the results, and to develop the proof of concept, and to do clinical trials, etc. Also, it is needed a financial leverage to produce and install the product in the market. That multimillionaire capacity is only in the hands of the pharmaceutical companies. But entrepreneurs and venture capitalists know that. It could be said that the heaven of a brain-intensive small company is the exit strategy of being acquired by large corporations, which boost their development, as you can see in numerous literature about that. As Marcia Angel of the Harvard Medical School stated that the most of the new drugs appeared on the market in recent years are sold and that are sold by large pharmaceutical companies came from research conducted in academic institutions, small biotech companies, or National Institute of Health, founded with the money of taxpayers. Something similar occurred in the case of public research institutes in Argentina. Their great technological achievements for the market are adopted by multinational companies, which are the only that can spread their research results worldwide. Bearing this situation in mind, it is possible to understand that the technology transfer laws and the modification of intellectual legislation were a requirement of the technological capital itself in developed countries, when it needed restructuring in order to extend its competitive capacities. These laws were a consequence and not a cause of the development in biotechnology. So, in the US, and in any example of a technological development around the world, the nexus between the strong action of the state and the new technological sector cannot be separated. But nothing of this is covered by the mainstream conception of science, technology, innovation, which focuses on the institutional system of incentives. Then we arrive to the conclusions. That is the second column. Firstly, there are external constraints for the development process of developing countries. The cultural difference between developed and developing countries is a consequence. in the case of the US, the state implemented laws that supported the process of technological change that mostly have benefited concentrated sector and have created technological barriers to prevent competitions from other countries. Secondly, it is necessary a state with capacity to create new technological sectors until the private initiative be strong enough to claim that by changing IP laws, the productive profile will be changed to the creation of greater incentives to R&D investment is not true, it's only part of the truth. Thus, if the state does not participate in the creation of technological sectors, the private sector will not do that. Thirdly, it is necessary to review the conventional approach to the studies of economic and technological processes. If not, its policy recommendation will be ineffective, and the mainstream social approach just will serve to legitimize the process of technological domain and, consequently, dependency. Basically, as far as I'm concerned, the need for developing countries is to recreate their reality from a new conceptual viewpoint. These findings are also political proposals for science, technology, and innovation policies in Argentina. As you could appreciate, our way was to show the emergence of a new technological paradigm, the description of the mainstream conceptual framework, and the proposal of the US as a role model, the recommendation of policies from the mainstream conceptual framework to developing countries, and after that, a critical revision of the US case and to the mainstream theory. The conclusions, and now, are the proposals. But in that case, the managerial proposals. Finally, from the experience of my fellowship, I could find managerial proposals too. The most important arose after my talk with Judith Rios San Juan, who is an IP attorney from Doctors Without Borders. In the same way that they are working on medicine patent pools, countries in the same situation that Argentina could contribute to an agricultural patent pool in order to cross-license their rights, to avoid barriers, and to improve our negotiation power. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Carolyn. That was excellent. That was excellent. I learned a lot from that presentation, and it's a fascinating area too. And we want to take questions from the audience, but why don't we start first? Ambassador, do you have any questions you'd like to ask him, or I could start? Yeah.
I think. Sorry. Congratulations. Really. Your presentation is very interesting, and we need to read again your paper, and especially without prejudice. Without prejudice, we need to think in innovative manners, and I'm seeing the Ambassador Pérez Gabilondo, and last week, Ambassador Pérez Gabilondo organized a meeting with our Minister of Science and Technology and many scientists of Argentina, from Argentina, that live here in New York. And I couldn't assist to the whole activity, but it's very important if I request the Ambassador Pérez Gabilondo to share with our fellowship the experience, because I remember that one of the decision makers said in a moment, we have many prototypes. We need now investment. We have imagination, ideas, a lot of ideas, but we need now find the private sector with a different attitude. In our country, I'm talking about Argentina. But at the same time, and I request your interesting experience at that moment, I wish to share with you the situation, for example, in our experience as a non-permanent member of the Security Council, for example, with humanitarian issues. You put on your presentation at the final Médecins Sans Frontières. Really, it's an enormous problem, the management of the knowledge. We have to think if not only products, knowledge, the knowledge that the humanity, the human being needs in suffering conditions, if that knowledge could rest as a private privilege. Things, for example, in DRC, and you find there a powerful source of resources, natural resources. But the causes of the conflict was clearly in that presence of natural resources. DRC, if you see the natural resources, gold, the minery may be an explosive and responsible exploitation, but you have 90% of the people in poverty. And at this moment is the capital of rape. These are not my words, it's the description that the Secretary General have done in the summit of a Great Lakes conference that took place last month, and we went with the Security Council there. And what happened? Yes, the NGOs can, they couldn't access to the humanitarian assistance because there are political problems to assist the people. But this is by the humanitarian actor has, for example, medicines, because the industry gives them medicines. But the people in that region of Africa couldn't produce medicine because the transference of technology is so expensive for non-development country or for we, the development country. At this moment, and I finish with this comment, and it's not a question, but it's a provocation for your ideas and your experience. At this moment, we are in the debate on the ODM, post-2015, the Millennium Development Goals. But at the same time, Rio plus 20. What it means? That we have to build new goals. So, we can imagine, Michael, that poverty is not a problem now, because the Millennium Goals are those objectives we arrived, and we accomplished all those objectives. And now, especially the developed country, are pushed on the agenda the sustainable development, green economies. It's a possibility? Yeah. It's an opportunity? Yeah. It's a risk for our countries? Yeah. How to think, and I invited you at the new school to think with us how to build this architecture that in the international community is in debate. What can we do post-2015 in terms of Millennium Development Goals, and what is the paradigm that we have to define? Only one to obtain a sustainable development. So, if the Democratic Republic of Congo or DRC is in a very strong situation because it's a problem of carity and no development, the globalization of the free and dignity will be very difficult.
Do you have a reaction to that?
First, there are points that are relevant for a country like Argentina, because what kind of technology development we have to pursue, what kind of objectives in technology have to be our objective, because the main technological developments are directed to luxury goods, and Argentina has to develop new technologies to satisfy that kind of demand. Is part of the same question, because if you have the objective of satisfy that kind of demand, you have to adapt a particular technological structure. And I think that we have to start a strong process of technological and economic development, but thinking in a new kind of demand, a new kind of society, and the technologies will be different. Will be social technologies with high social participation and focus on the people most in need and not in the people who can pay for that new technology.
Well, maybe I could ask a question. And again, I very much agreed with most of your analysis of what's happened in the United States in terms of intellectual property. And I think your point is very well taken that the state is always involved, whether it's through setting the rules, but even more importantly in funding. So in the United States, our system works because the government is willing to fund basic research, and then it's a question of what happens with that research after it's been funded. I probably didn't understand well enough, but is your idea that some of the developing countries have a different economic structure, that the ideal form or the optimal form of a intellectual property regime is different from the United States? Okay. Maybe you could just explain to me the difference.
Cannot be, because we are, as members of the World Trade Organization, we have to accept the agreement, the TRIPS agreement, and the patent laws are similar, but as I wanted to show is that, for example, in the US case, the difference between invention and discovery is not clear. Then you can protect DNA, as in the case that I showed. In Argentina, that kind of protection is not possible. In fact, we have a most rigorous system of patent and not allowed a strong protection, mainly in biotechnology. But in general aspects are similar. The system, the patent, the intellectual property system all around the world or in the countries that are members of the World Trade Organization.
Well, I guess maybe my question was more, let's put aside TRIPS in the World Trade Organization. Let's just see what would be the ideal system for a country, for any countries other than the U.S. Are there alternative forms of intellectual property systems that you think would be better or produce more, in terms of technology for that country?
I think that it's not possible to develop new system of protection, but you can find some new tools that serves with other objectives, like what they mentioned, the pool of patents is one of the possibilities, on the Creative Commons, with people sharing to a knowledge that will be the free access. Just you have to recognize the.
But would this be from private action, or would this be state mandated somehow? Those sort of pools of.
Both are necessary. I think that the intellectual property is a kind of. It's a way of in which a private investor can recover his investment, but the problem now is that the system is not receiving a good use. The rights are.
I guess my question is, what is the alternative? If the system now does.
Well,
what's the alternative system?
Las alternatives that I propose are the strong action of the state, the state strongly involved in the economic development processes, as is in the case in the U.S., and not only providing new system of incentive, but the state investment and protecting the formation of new technological areas is one of the solutions. Other solutions can come from the civil society too.
Okay. Mr. Besser, you had a question. Yeah.
Thank you, and let me first congratulate Germán Linzer for his presentation, and let me briefly taking up the challenge of Ambassador Perceval mentioned about the Ministry of Science and Technology, who was coming to New York last week, and as she mentioned, we organized a meeting with scientists at the consulate in the framework of the Programa Raíces, Program Ruth of the Ministry of Technology and Innovation that was mentioned briefly by Germán at the beginning. A key element in that program is to encourage Argentinians who are researching abroad to come back to the country, and the tools that they use are the offering of scholarship, the opening of line of research in Argentina, and the possibility to insert them in the labor market in the field that they had been been working abroad. And one key issue in the discussion between the ministry and the people who attend the meeting is the need from a state perspective to build up a bridge between two cultures. In one hand, the culture of the scientific and the research, which is encapsulated in their own investigations, and on the other hand, the private sector, which should apply that result of the investigations. Those are two completely different worlds, and the role of the states is to build up a bridge in that, trying to present the perspective to the private sector that in the long term is beneficial for them to taking up some of the new research that may be developed and put those in sort of industrial application. And on the other hand, trying to develop a conception that the lines of investigation that the state may offer and the researchers may take are those who need to go beyond the border of the science as such and to spread in the society as a whole. This could be my comments about the experience last week in the consulate. And coming back to the presentation, I just would like perhaps to put one question from two different perspectives. From the perspective of the model that you explained, the US model as has been developed in the 80s, I'm wondering if in the last 10 years there was some changes in the model or a different perception in the society or different perception at the political level in the following sense. During the 90s and during the Uruguay round, after the TRIPS were negotiated, when United States started to negotiate free trade agreements with different countries in Latin America, they push for a sort of TRIPS plus, and even more protection than that protection negotiated under the TRIPS. But curiously, in 2005, 2006, the Congress of the US, in declarations and letters of many representatives, sent letters to the USTR asking them to stop to push Latin American countries to go further of what appears in the TRIPS agreement, basically because they thought that if this experience is translated to the American markets, the affordable medicine for poor people in the US could be jeopardized. So the question would be, is this a change in the US? Was just a particular circumstances? Which is your perception how this evolved? And from the perspective of a developing country, and you mentioned the sector of biotechnology, I am wondering if when you get more competitiveness in the world, if it's not could be necessary perhaps to enhance some protections in those areas specifically when you compete in the world market. These will be the two questions. Thank you.
Starting with the second, yes, I'm not against some political measures or laws like the intellectual property. If you live in a capitalist world, you have to have a law of intellectual property. For example, in my institution, I am the intellectual property manager. And why a public institution have to protect their technologies? Aren't they public for all the world, all the people in the country? The answer is yes, we must produce public goods, but if we don't protect our research results, won't be adopted by a national company, will be adopted by a strong company with a big power to transform that research result in a product. That's why we use the intellectual property as a tool to develop some national goals. In the same way, I think that if we live in a capitalist world, we have to have, and all the countries need to have an intellectual property right. It's like the case of an army, or if other country is ready to war, you have to have some kind of a way to defend your own interest. That is the same situation with IP. I don't like IP by itself. It's not good. But if you live in a world, in capitalist world, you have to have some IP measures. And for the first question, I'm not sure if some things are changing here in the US, because I didn't find an academic group of people developing ideas in social, scientific, technological, and innovation policies, because you are developing those things in the practical field, and is my interpretation of why you don't have in a university. I didn't find, for example, a master degree like mine in social, scientific, technological, and innovation policies and management. We need to develop that knowledge, but maybe you don't feel that necessity because things are like are. Then I'm not sure that things are changing. When I was searching for information in the web page of some companies that I showed in my presentation, I could find that those companies declared how many, what is their investment in political campaigns. And then I'm not sure that things are going to change when that big companies that are the base of the strongest IP laws are pleased to modify the IP position of the US.
Do we have any questions from?
Sorry, may I?
Sure, yeah.
Because I teach epistemology. We have different levels of discussions here. One is the model or the possible models, paradigms, how to develop science and technology in our country, in the region. And this is one level of the discussion. Nobody is against the need to develop science and technology to obtain comprehensive development in the 21st century. This is one discussion. The other one is intellectual property. And this is another discussion, because we have to link the rules in the international community, the rules that determine the property of the innovations, products, good ideas, and this is the debate not only in the OIM, especially in the trade organization. And this is a present discussion. And another level of this interesting challenge that our scholars put on the table is how to link the responsibility of the state to promote science and technology, to go for the better condition of life of the the community or the society, and how is the link between the state and the private sector. But it's not as within this situation many years ago. How we think in the state, in cooperation with another states, and the private sector, not only from my country, but in the perspective on transnational business companies and investment. For example, in our region, many of the most interesting developments are projects that are regional projects in energy infrastructure, also in urbanism, human security, and there are regional projects. Have we the capacity to transform this project in sustainable policies in our region or in another regions? But this is the risk and the responsibility that we have in our region. We advance. We have better conditions of life, health, education. How we can transform this situation in sustainable results. And finally, I think we have to imagine the future that is not no, the future arrive tomorrow. How we think in the future, if the future is just planified in the think tanks and also in the international community that is United Nations, we have the high-level groups established, and you know better than me, Mike, the indicators, the categories, and the paradigms for the future we have, we need, and we want. For example, in the Millennium Development Goals post-2015. So I think you introduce in your paper different levels, and all of them are very important, but not the same.
Do we have a question? Yeah.
Thank you. It was really great. My question is about indigenous communities, because you're talking a lot about the formal levels, and there's a large indigenous amount of people in Latin America in different groups. And I wondered about local knowledge, ancestral knowledge, and when you're talking about the models for those countries like Argentina and the state to intervene, what would it be like in terms of utilizing local knowledge and local resources? Should those groups have the rights over the property, and what should that relationship be?
Maybe the ambassador can answer, but we are the signatories of the biodiversity convention or agreement. I don't know exactly the name in English. And we protect also the folklorical knowledge, but we are signatories, adhere and approve that that convention. A lot of countries protect that, and we too.
Sorry, but your question is very interesting, because when this afternoon we're working with Seman in these remarks, the first version of our remarks was the scientific, academical knowledge. So, because I read usually Boaventura de Sousa Santos, for example, a pensamiento débole, and if Rorty, from the pragmatism of United States, you know that the power of the academical knowledge is a definition and a decision. It's very important. I study many hours a day, but it's the traditional knowledge. And when I read the remarks, you heard academical and social knowledge, collective experience, and I have a little example. I come from the mountains, from Mendoza, and an old woman that live in rural areas of the pre-cordillera, in the hills, can say, "Oh, you had a headache? Well, if you go there, you see that herb." And you couldn't see nothing, but she can. "Well, you see that herb? That is the specific herb for your headache." Well, and not only in the health knowledge, because it's a stereotype. There are many knowledge. For example, in justice, how to resolve controversies in a community. One of the problems in South Sudan, for example, at the moment, is that the security sector reform, the justice reform, with the imperative of only one model, the people don't understand that. The people doesn't understand that model of justice. It's necessary, yes, but you have to maintain, preserve the communitary justice, because the conflict grows in a spectacular manner in South Sudan. So I return. The problem with traditional and present knowledge of our indigenous community is that they know perfect, but they couldn't access to patent the knowledge because they don't have that conception, because our indigenous people understand that the earth is not a private property, it's a common good.
Well, we're probably near the end, but any time for one more question? Would you like to say something in conclusion, or we can just let you rest? And
Here in the new school, it's very interesting to be here at the council.
That's great. Thank you. Thank you. Will you come back then? Please come back. Thank you. And thank you, Ambassador, very much for being with us tonight. And again, congratulations to you. An excellent paper, and I do hope you're enjoying your time here in New York, here at the New School, and you're now part of our family. So please come back. All right? Thank you, everybody.